You didn't go to school for that. No one trained you for that. And worst of all, management is typically opaque to outsiders.
Hi, Gilad. I thought it'd be really interesting to talk a little bit about the difference between working at startups and big tech. So, I've never worked at big tech. You have. I think we've both experienced working at startups. So, what are your thoughts? What are the differences?
Yeah, thank you, John. So throughout my career, I've worked at both. I spent about a decade working in renewable energies in a smaller company. And then I also worked at Amazon and Meta later on in my career. And at the start of my career, I actually also worked at Intel as a firmware engineer. So I really got to experience both. And I really think there definitely are pros and cons to both. In a startup, you can be a jack of all trades. You get to experience more of everything that surrounds the actual craft of writing code. The big benefit that I see for working at big tech is just the number of people there. And that makes it much easier to find mentors, to find people who can be role models for you. That is always useful, but it's especially useful at the transition point going beyond senior, getting to staff or to senior leadership roles. At big tech, you just have more people who walked this path before you. So, staff, senior staff, if you work at a smaller company, there just may not be scope for that role. And even if there is, you won't have a lot of role models that you can learn from. And the process will really need to be tailored just for you because the company hasn't done a lot of those promotions before. So if you want to grow in the IC track to more senior levels, definitely I think big tech is the way to go.
Yeah, that's true. As I think about it, my first startup, there were two software engineers, me and someone else. So there's not much choice in the way of mentors and the people to learn from. The flip side of that, as you say, I got exposure to far more things. I talked to the head of marketing when we had a big marketing push, and this is going back a few years, hence what we did. Everyone in the office got together and stuffed envelopes to send out marketing messages. So I did software engineering, I did sysadmin, I did a bit of help desk and support, I did some marketing support. It was a chance to get exposure to absolutely everything, as you say. Very, very limited on the mentoring with one other software guy in the company.
Yeah, and I think just on that point, I think it's worth double clicking a bit on this because the term startup is really vague. And you may be part of a small team of software engineers, and then you have to do everything. You need to work with marketing, sales, finance, legal, DevOps. You get exposure to everything. There are a lot of companies that we call startups where you may be part of 100 engineers in the org and be insulated from this. You won't get the experience of working with marketing and sales, and at the same time, you won't have a lot of role models for more senior roles. So be really careful about when you say startup versus big tech. There's a lot of companies in the middle.
Yeah, there's a lot of life cycle stages, and a company at 2 people is very different to one at 10 people, very different to one at 50 people, and very different again at 100. I can't quite remember what all the different numbers are, but I do remember in that first role somebody telling me that most companies fail at certain points because they reaching that next level of scale. And his numbers were something like 1, 5, 50. One of the VCs in Silicon Valley, I believe, talks about the 3 and 10. So every multiple of 3 or 10, you get a breaking point, which not quite the same numbers, but the sort of same level of scales and order of magnitude. And it exposes different areas, doesn't it? I want a slight pivot there because I want to pick on something you've mentioned. So you've seen Intel, Amazon, and Meta. One of the, I think, misconceptions a lot of people have is that if you worked at big tech, you must have been doing some amazing planet scale stuff, which, having worked at a number of big companies, I'm inclined to think that there's probably, just like every other big company, a number of people who are working on some amazing stuff and a whole bunch of people who are dealing with what I'd call business as usual work, all that mundane stuff that you have to do to keep a company of that scale going that might be nothing more than, hey, I'm building some software for us to do a mail merge so we can send out employee pay slips or other business as usual things. What did you see was the balance? What would you say was a realistic expectation for people to have if they're going into a big tech, of whether they'll be doing very business as usual or planet scale stuff?
Yes, I think this is a really important point. There's the conception of big company, small peg in the machinery of a big company, and you have a really narrow view of a tiny problem, and that's everything that you're doing. And that can be maintenance work, not very exciting work. And the reality is that, yes, that definitely is something that exists. There is variance between different companies in how much the balance is between people doing cutting edge work and people doing more maintenance work. There's a lot of value in the maintenance work as well, by the way. I don't want to discount that. Some of the best engineers I've met are what Meta internally calls fixers. These are people who can, jump into a really gnarly problem and find ways to improve performance, to improve maintainability. And they fix the code and they fix the organization which created that code. So there's value in both sides. The big benefit I see for big tech is if you are motivated and if you assume ownership of your career, you have agency to navigate within this large org to find the place that is best suited for your career growth. So you have that flexibility to navigate with internal mobility to find a place where you can find the role models, you can find the challenges that will stretch you.
Yeah, absolutely. And a good example that I've recently thought about this, I think it applies to both Meta and Google, is a lot of people's perception is that Meta and Google, you'll be building this massive website like Google or Facebook.com that is going to be servicing billions of users. But there are lots of other really interesting things that they do that you forget about. So to take your point, you can find your niche. Most people probably don't think that as a compiler writer or programming language developer, you could find a niche. But I think Meta on Hack and Google on Go have both done development of programming language. I believe they've supported a number of other programming languages too. So, for example, I think Meta at the moment is currently putting developers into Python. So again, you could not be necessarily a web developer. You could be a compiler developer and find your niche. I guess Meta probably has people in graphics and 3D for the VR element and so on. So, as you say, with these big companies, there's a chance to find that niche in every little bit of it. So, yeah, a lot of opportunities you won't get at a startup necessarily. I'm going to pivot slightly there. There's always an ongoing debate between should you be a specialist or generalist. What's your view on that, God?
Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting question. And especially today with AI and the job market and the challenge of finding jobs in 2025, there's really a bifurcated market between people who are doing AI and just software engineers in general. And that tends to lead people to hone in on being a specialist. And if we just take AI and just say, look at how we do vision with machine learning, it's gone through three main completely different ways of doing that over the past 2 decades, from the current kind of large language models having vision components to them, from before that to just more fine-tuned neural networks, to before that doing what we today call classical computer vision. And so the risk of being a specialist is you can jump on a wagon today and in 3 years you'll need to completely reinvent yourself. That is not always the case. The bias I have, so here's my mental model of an engineering career as an individual contributor. There are 3 main chapters in your career that you can opt to go through. The first stage is craftsmanship. It's your first few years in the industry. You need to develop your skill set on how to actually build software, coding, and everything that goes along with it. The second chapter that you can then pursue is leadership. That's where you get into the more senior engineer role, staff engineer, where you're still developing your craft. That never goes away, but you also need to develop new skill sets around influence and scaling yourself and impacting and uplifting others. The third career stage, which is more, at Meta, Amazon terms, more senior staff and beyond, is what I call specialization. And at those levels, you really find that the really best engineers in the world, they've developed their craft, they continue to develop their craft. they've developed their leadership skills, and they're continuing to develop their leadership skills. But then they're also specializing in what makes them amazing, in what makes them unique, at what they're really strong at. Now, that can be, being really great at working with marketing and sales, and bringing an engineering point of view and really building impact and leading and have been a craftsperson, but also connecting all these different functions. It can also be as a generalist of really looking at really large software challenges that span multiple fields and being able to have influence. It can also be really niche, like being a world expert in large language models. If you work through this progression, then specialization is a sustainable advantage that you have, because you build a foundation of craftsmanship, you build a foundation of leadership, and through these years, you've learned what you're really great at. You can't know that before you're put yourself out there and collect feedback from the people who look at you from different vantage points. And once you do this and do this work and find what you're great at, and then double down exactly on that, then you have a competitive advantage that's sustainable and no one can compete with you.
Yeah, I love that way of thinking about it. I think it's something that a lot of people struggle to find, or they maybe find it, then don't quite find. I guess part of the problem, if we're in a startup or a small organization, there aren't necessarily the roles that fit you for that area. It's an interesting one. You touched a little bit on the leadership there, so let's have a slight segue into something else I've been thinking out recently. I think something that big tech has always been very good at, from my perception as an outsider, is having a separate management and individual contributor track. Something that I think historically businesses in the UK have been very bad at. And we're starting to get better, but we're still a little way behind, which is a bit frustrating personally, having gone back and forth between the IC and manager track personally a few times. And I see a lot of people struggling to decide, like say, especially outside the US and Silicon Valley, of which track they should stay on. So do you have any thoughts on how you decide which track to stay on, and what you might do thinking about that specialization of your career to identify your USP or unique strengths in that area?
Yeah. So throughout my career, I was kind of pushed towards management several times. Sometimes I pushed back, sometimes I didn't. The separate career ladder for individual contributors is definitely one of the strengths of, the more modern US companies. It's definitely lagging in Europe. I am seeing the changes there. So the question is, okay, how do you decide? And the first question is, what really motivates you? If you are really looking to earn more money, then right now in many companies, the only path is to pursue management. Now, I think there are 2 points I really want to call out. First, there's leadership and there's management, and those two are not the same. You can be a leader without being a manager. In some companies, they won't have a role for you to progress on the IC track formally in the way the org structure, the titles are designed. That does not mean you can actually fill that role without the title. You can still be a leader as an individual contributor in a company without a dual track. You just won't get the formal recognition for that work. The second part that goes along with this is that leadership and management are related but not the same, is that management is different. Management is not software engineering. It's a completely new field. And if you look back to how you started as an engineer, you either went to college or went through boot camp, learned how to code, got your first job. I'm sure you had a lot to learn in your first job, even though you probably spent years or months training for that first role. And you still had so much to learn in your first few years. When you switch to management, you're switching to a whole new career. You need a whole new skill sets, whole new tools, and you didn't go to school for that. No one trained you for that. And worst of all, management is typically opaque to outsiders. So when you started as an engineer, you looked at other engineers, you could see what they were doing, you see what they created. When you look at your manager as an engineer, I had no idea what my managers were doing as an IC. I met them in one-on-ones. They seemed to be in meetings all days. I had no idea what their job actually is like. So when you transition into management, you didn't get any training, you have no idea what to expect, and it's a whole new field that you need to then consciously invest in actually learning. So that's another thing that think is really important to understand. It's not just a progression in software engineering, it's a whole new field.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a whole separate career. I feel quite lucky early in my career that I did get a little bit of idea of what they did and how they did it, but only really because I was fortunate enough to know some of the managers from for a few years, and that gave me the confidence, or maybe the naivety, to just sit down and ask them, like, what do you do all day? Why are you doing this? So being curious gave me access to that. But one of my great frustrations throughout my career is we send so few managers on any training of how to be a manager. Instead, the 3 times that companies sent me on management training as a new manager to that company, it's been, here's how you put someone in a pit and here's how you fire them, our way. I repeat this a lot because I find it so frustrating. I don't want to know how to fire somebody. I want to get better at making them great, making a great team in the first place. How do I create the inputs that are correct so we get a positive output, not after it's all gone wrong, how do I blame them for the mistakes that we as an organization or me as a manager has made? Because, again, I feel strongly if you get to the point where you're firing somebody, you are at least partly to blame. You hired the wrong person, or you put the wrong person into the wrong role, or you put a person into the wrong role, or you failed to spot something was going wrong, or something went wrong in their life that's external and you failed to account for that and adjust. And I think there will always be perhaps people who are wrong and maybe something changes or whatever and they're the wrong person, and maybe a percentage that have to go and that's not your fault. But I think the vast majority of cases, it's something that we did wrong as an organization or as a manager or the previous person in the role did. So getting down to firing someone is just putting the blame on them for the mistakes that we have made in advance, things that we could have done with them to improve it. So I've always wondered, how do we get that training so we don't get to that point? How do I make sure I hire the right people and hire properly? So I don't hire somebody and then have to fire them, because that's a massive drain on the organization. It's a drain on you as a manager. It's a drain on your team, and it's traumatic for that person. Or how do we take a person that's maybe was a great fit, but the role's changed? So how do we upskill them? Or how do we find them a different position in the organization? Or all those things. What are your thoughts on that? And what suggestions do you have for somebody that's in that position?
Yeah, I think this is my main passion. This is mostly what I do. So I do interview preparation, but most of what I do is really helping managers improve in their career. And so if I have to think about, what advice I have for newer managers, I think the most important piece of advice I can give is really about what your job is. And I've read tons of books, research papers. What is the definition of a manager? And in Silicon Valley, the common definition is taking Andy Grove's definition. He was the president of Intel at its top. And he said that the output of the manager is the output of the organization under the responsibility, roughly like that. And I think that is true, but there's a more useful lens to look at that. Useful in the sense that as a new manager, you can translate that to something concrete that you can apply in your day to day job. And so the definition I like to teach is that the manager's role is to create positive and sustainable change in the performance of the organization. The first part is create. And I think that's really important because when you switch from IC, writing code, landing, creating outputs that are out there in the world, you switch to a manager and your work happens behind the scenes. You don't get dopamine cycles. So you really need to look at management as an act of creation. And the key insight is the change, is creating changes, is not the current output of the organization. Your job is to increase the capability of your team to create output that is valuable. So it's up-leveling people, improving how people collaborate, improving relationships with different teams, processes, culture, all of that. It's through the lens of how do I take this group of humans and make them capable of delivering more.
Yeah, I saw you talk about that definition of a manager the other day, and I love that. I think that's brilliant, and I'm shamelessly going to be stealing that from now on. I really like the way you phrased it as the act of creation there, because I think that's such a great way of thinking about it. Because then, if you think from that, your role as a manager is to create the opportunity for somebody to step outside their comfort zone and take on more, maybe be a leader. Maybe that's something as simple as chairing a meeting. Maybe it's taking the lead on a small project or something. It's to create the opportunity for somebody to engage with a mentor, or create the opportunity for somebody to go on some training or learn a new skill, or all those things. And there's lots of different ways you can be creative then as a manager that are creating that positive and sustainable change that don't involve nagging people for estimates and blaming them if you don't hit the deadline up there. They can be positive elements. And you can view all those things like, oh, miss a deadline, like, how do we create the learning opportunity out of this? How do we create that opportunity to, do a post-mortem, figure out why we didn't hit the deadline and create that positive, sustainable change from it? If you view it from that lens of creation, I think that's really positive. Cool. You mentioned interview prep there. So I want to pivot slightly there because when we're preparing for interviews, I find a lot of people that, particularly if they're new to the management track, and I've been talking to a friend about this recently, which is why it's top of mind for me. He's kind of on that borderline, recently been moved into a management role, not sure if that's where he fits. And he's had some thoughts about possibly moving and moving on, been doing some interviews and found that quite a struggle. And I think this is, again, affecting a lot of people at the moment. There's perhaps people who haven't interviewed in several years and the market's very different now. Or when they did interview several years ago, if you were a warm body and sounded like a competent software engineer, it was very easy to get hired, where now they're finding it's actually a real skill set and they need to develop. So a lot of people have no idea how to approach some of these interviews and tackle some of the questions you'll get in a behavioral interview, for example. What advice would you have for somebody that's facing perhaps their first behavioral interview round as a new manager and trying to demonstrate that they can have the right impact and influence as either an engineering manager with 1 or 2 years experience, or maybe as an engineering manager that's looking to transition back to a staff plus level role?
Yeah, so I'll address both more senior IC track and the manager track. So interviewing is always an emotional roller coaster. Some seasons are easier, some seasons are more challenging. Right now in 2025, it's more of a challenge to get a job. Again, some caveats if you're in AI. So since this is coding chats, I'll address this through this lens. Your best bet is to pre-compute as much as possible. The actual interview is showtime. You need to perform. You're under a lot of pressure. You're going to be nervous. You're going to get curveballs. And so the best thing you can do to prepare is to pre-compute as much as possible. So this is the algorithm I recommend. The first part is to figure out what are the areas that the company will cover. That can be things like performance management, what you mentioned about low performers. Do you need to fire them? Can you turn them around? How do you approach that? Hiring, recruiting. It can be resolving conflicts. It can be fostering collaboration, how you grow your organization and your people. And in more IC roles, it's more leadership without authority. How do you influence the broader organization? And so you can do some legwork to figure out what are the main topics that will be covered. It changes between companies, but not that much. So this is the first step in the algorithm. The second step is brainstorm. Brainstorm situations from your past where you had to display you had to react to these challenges. You had to work through these challenges. So with no bars, just brainstorm. Put all of that on a piece of paper or a new document. Just write all of that down. That's pass number one. Then you do a second pass, like compilers that are multi-pass. In the second pass, for each story, you have one job, and that is to figure out what specifically was hard about this situation that you were in. You're looking for the most challenging aspect of that situation? What made it difficult for you to be successful or not be successful, but to work through that challenge? It can be just needing to collaborate with other functions for the first time and talking with marketing people for the first time. Or it can be the scope of the work. You needed to lead 24 engineers and get them aligned towards a common goal. It can be just the level of ambiguity. Figuring out what to actually do was really, really hard. And so there are all these different aspects of what can make a situation challenging. And your job in the second pass is to write down a really clear title for the story and why it was hard. Once you have this for your stories, you can start deleting stories. Any story that doesn't convey a really clear challenge, you should scrap it and delete it. And so once you're done, you have a mapping between the areas that the companies are looking to collect signal on and pre-filtered stories for each of these dimensions. And you have the title, you have the moral of the story, the key message that you want to convey. This was a hard situation because. Once you have that, you can talk about, okay, you can prepare on how to tell the story and how to be crisp and concise. That really doesn't matter as much. In my experience, 80% of being successful in an interview is choosing the right stories. You're going to get curveballs afterwards. You're going to have an interview that will prod you and surprise you with their follow-up questions. As long as you chose the right story, you're most likely to be successful. So that's my biggest recommendation. Invest ahead of time in choosing the strongest stories.
So what do we mean by choosing the right stories then? What would be an example of something that is the right story and something that is a wrong story?
Yeah, so if we take, for example, a conflict situation. If you're applying for a staff or a senior staff role or a manager role, and the conflict is there was a disagreement on the technical design, and we talked about it in the meeting, we realized, oh, yeah, we talked about it, we did the pros and cons, and there was a really clear winner, and so we went with that. That's not a very interesting story because there wasn't a lot of challenge, there wasn't a lot of friction. A more interesting story is we were working on a large system architecture, and we had really strong disagreements between the tech leads from each of the two teams. And you as the manager or you as the overall tech lead, you worked with them behind the scenes to figure out what their motivations are. Maybe you uncovered something surprising. In big tech, oftentimes there are things below the surface. You can call them politics. Or, it's a really common scenario for a project to be someone's promotion project. They need it for their promotion. And so they want to push it so that they own that, even though it doesn't really make a lot of sense. So you do the legwork to figure out what was happening below the scenes. And then you do the legwork to find creative win-win solutions, or you have hard conversations so that you can do what's right for the company. So you need to have that pain. You need to have something that's hard that you had to overcome and learn from and grow from. It shouldn't be trivial. And that is really dependent on the level that you're applying for. It'll be very different for a mid-level engineer versus senior staff or senior manager.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that a lot of people miss, particularly if they haven't put that time into, as you say, pre-computing and figuring out what their hard stories are. And I think, again, if you haven't interviewed for several years and you're used to that time when it was very easy to turn up and be moderately competent and get an offer, it's perhaps a different environment that people aren't used to. Talking then about that early stage manager who's maybe a year or so into their management career, they might not have dealt with an underperformer, or they might not have dealt with a particular prioritization problem. What do you suggest they do for a situation like that where they have no story?
Yeah, so that's a real challenge. So when you interview, you're selling your services. And if you have a gap in your services, you have a gap in your services. You can try and invent a story with a good interviewer that will very quickly collapse. And if you lie in an interview, the outcome may be not just not getting a hire, but having a red flag so that you can never apply for that company again. So I always recommend to be truthful in your interviews. You can discuss what not to share and what to share, but you should never be anything but honest in what you answer. So in that case, managing a low performer, that's a really necessary skill that companies need from their leaders. As you mentioned, are they just going to fire them, or are they going to try and grow them? And how are they going to do that without the blast radius kind of bringing everyone else down and the project down? So you may find some companies that are willing to accept that. In bigger tech, this is called like an M0 role. And most big tech companies don't hire externally for those roles. They only hire externally for people with some leadership experience. And so my general recommendation for people in those situations is do the interview prep, identify those big dimensions, brainstorm your stories, filter the stories that are not exceptional, and then see what gaps you have. And then try to leverage the time you have in your current job to gain more exposure to that gap. Now, this doesn't mean trying to force someone to be a low performer. Sometimes it's just not there. That's the reality. What you can do is try to focus on someone who is not exceptional, and through your contributions, you can try and uplift them. That's the best thing you can do, barring the experience, is to reframe this as not someone who's just not meeting expectations, someone who's meeting expectations but is capable of much more, and then frame that through this lens of creating positive and sustainable change, of your contributions to working on their motivations, to working on their skill sets, so that they can really flourish and be the best version of themselves.
So the performance wasn't a great example. Communication or prioritization might have been better, as you say. You can step up and maybe volunteer to lead a project or volunteer to project management something, then you've got some chance to talk about prioritization, and would have been a more positive example. So sorry about that. There's slightly different ways that sometimes questions are faced, as in, like, how would you handle this situation? How would you recommend that somebody approach those? Should they have a particular, these are the frameworks I use, or this is my philosophy about that? And what would you suggest there?
Yeah, this is a really great question. So just a minute of taking a step back and being a little bit philosophical. There are two main styles of interviews. One is simulation based, like lead code, system design. You're put in this artificial situation and the company sees how you perform. The second style is looking backwards, seeing how you behaved in previous situations and using that to extrapolate on how you will behave in similar situations in the past. Those are two distinct interviewing techniques, and most companies mix them. In behavioral interviews, which are really tell me about a time, they're the second style of interviewing, of looking backwards to extrapolate towards the future. There are cases where you'll get questions about your philosophy. How would you approach, or tell me about your approach to one-on-ones, as another example. And this is more common in more senior roles, where part of what the companies are trying to assess is, do you have your own distinct philosophy, your own approach? The way I sometimes explain this for senior manager candidates is, if you're a senior manager, you have more experience to pattern match against. And so you will naturally develop some rules of thumbs, some ways of operating. You may not clearly articulate them, but just based on the experience in pattern matching, something exists in your brain. If you also need to coach managers and support managers, then you will need to share your experience and knowledge with them. And so that's where the articulation part comes in. And so if you can explain how you approach general situations, that gives signal that you've likely had to coach people in the past. That said, my general recommendation is still to connect it to an actual story. Even if the interviewer doesn't directly ask, often they'll ask in a follow-up question. So talk about your general approach to a situation and then give an example where you applied this approach, so that the interviewer sees the experience, sees that it's something you lived through. And it's not just, I read this in a blog somewhere and remembered it for the interview, but I've never actually done it.
Yeah. So you mentioned more senior candidates there. Are there any other advice in sort of very broad terms that you'd suggest that allow a more experienced manager to show that they are more experienced than? So let's say somebody that's got 10 years of management experience versus somebody with 2 years management experience. What can they do in that behavioural interview to really set themselves apart and show that? You sort of hinted at that with showing that you've managed other managers. Are there any other things that you'd suggest?
So I think the biggest advice is, again, to go to that pre-compute. When you filter your stories on the challenge, ask yourself this question. Say you're aiming for a senior manager or senior staff. Would the typical manager or would the typical staff engineer in the company I'm applying for, would they really struggle in this situation? And you really need to find that delta, that bar that you're passing at the next level, to really showcase the experience, the challenge that you worked through and were successful versus people at the level below what you're applying for. Now, as I mentioned, in manager roles, a lot of kind of how do you manage managers come through, how do you do skip level meetings without burning trust, how do you approach that differently than your regular one-on-ones? Those are all really examples that come from experience. And so just think about what in your experience differentiates you from people at the level below what you're applying for, and make sure that that's in the title that you have for each story, so that you build your star, Carl, whatever format you use. I actually have an uncommon opinion. I think it doesn't matter as much as everyone says how you narrate your story. It is 100% important. It's just not as important as choosing the right story. And choosing the right story and having the key message you want to convey.
Yeah, I'm with you. Star, Carl, whatever. It's, to my mind, it's more of a prompt for you to make sure you hit those points of explaining, what the situation was, what your contribution was, and what the outcome was. And if there's anything useful lessons learned that came out of that as well that you can perhaps highlight. I think one of the things in a lot of places that perhaps sets apart a senior manager is that depth of experience. So any way that you can suggest that somebody in maybe a 45-minute behavioural interview where they might only get asked 6 or 7 questions, how do you show you've got more depth than someone else? What are the options for that?
Yeah, so the best way to do that in a really time-constrained manner is to present the interviewer with a menu of options and invite them to choose which option you double-click on. So say you have 3 stories. Each of them you've pre-computed and filtered for challenge. And the interviewer asks you a question like, tell me about a time you managed a low performer. And you can say, yeah, I can tell you about a time I had a manager who was just not meeting performance. I had a staff engineer who was really struggling in a new setup. And I also had a really junior engineer, but that was a really challenging and unexpected situation to support them. Which story do you want me to talk about? And so when you're doing that, you're sharing your breadth without going into depth at all. And you're also letting the interviewer choose what to double click on. And so you're giving them confidence that if they chose path A, you were willing to go on paths B and C. And so they can mentally extrapolate and see your depth and gain confidence that you have that depth.
Yeah, I love that approach. I think that's a great way of, as you say, showing the depth and very, very quickly and succinctly demonstrating that, hey, I've not just dealt with this once, I've dealt with it multiple times. I've been there and got the t-shirt, as we used to say. Cool, thank you. Let's pivot slightly now and talk about something else that we picked up on and kind of got us started on this originally. Where do you see as the importance of side projects in somebody's personal development?
Yeah, so first of all, as a manager, I think that's really important. Managers have to stay technical. They have to stay hands-on. And how to do that well as a manager is really hard. There are 9 wrong ways to do it for every one good way. One thing to do is build side projects. When I was into intermittent fasting several years ago, I was not happy with any of the apps out there. So I just built an app for myself. And if you build something for yourself, you do the first 20% of the work, that gets you 80% of the benefit. You don't need to worry about scaling. You don't need to worry about so many things. And so you can just build something for yourself. You maintain, those technical skills. there's a lot of ways to do that on the job, mostly by working with cross-functional partners. AI is really interesting here is that it makes it maybe a bit not as valuable as it was 3 years ago. But if you can work with your marketing partner or your HR partner and you notice they have some pains, you can build something for them. And so you're both maintaining your technical skills, you're also building relationships, and you're helping the company. So there are many ways on how to maintain technical skills on the job. Besides that, engineering is just such a magical field. So one of my passions is origami, paper folding, and I've spent decades on that. Traveled to conventions, and in the early 2000s, I built a website. First time doing PHP, first time doing web development, to build a community around folding paper. It was called Origami Tips. You can find it on the Wayback Machine. So you can really bring software engineering into so many aspects of life. It's really a magical field that we're in.
Yeah, that's very cool. That's very cool. I've not come across that approach to combining origami and learning PHP. That's very cool. Very different. Yeah, I think there's a few things there that I want to pick. I seem to be one of the few engineers that feel that you don't have to stay technical to be a good manager, which is, I think, somewhat ironic considering that I've gone back and forth between being an IC and being a manager, and I'm quite technical. I mean, my core thing at the moment is coding challenges, teaching people to be better software engineers and finding interesting and challenging bits of software to build and clone. But from my personal experience, some of the best managers I've ever had have been non-technical, but have been very, very good at understanding and empathizing with the challenges that software engineers face, even if their coding ability doesn't stretch much beyond building a macro in Excel. So why do you feel it's so important for people or for engineering managers to stay hands-on?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question, and I would not use the term hands-on, for example.
Okay.
So here's the example I like to give. If you progress in your manager career, at some point you'll reach what's called general manager, where you're supporting a P&L, an independent unit with its own profit and loss. And in that case, you'll typically manage people who are not engineers. You'll need to work with other functions that you have no experience doing that. And the question is, how do you do a good job there? How do you build that empathy that you mentioned with the core challenges of that job function? So managers should be not hands-on, but should be technical in each of the fields that they are responsible for. Now, as an example, Amazon, for senior managers and beyond, they ask managers to go to the warehouses once a year. They ask managers to do customer support calls. That's an example of gaining exposure, building a deeper understanding of the challenges across the company, and it provides you with the experience to better support people in multiple roles. So when you're an engineering manager, you need to have that empathy. And you're starting off with a bank full of empathy for people because that's how you came through. Eventually, you need to build the skills. How do you develop empathy for multiple functions? And I really think the only way to really build that deeper empathy is to do what they're doing, is to practice that. You don't need to be good at it. You don't need to be better than anyone else at that. You just need to get friction, direct contact with what that role entails in the day-to-day life at some low frequency so that you can build that empathy. That's my take, at least, on being technical as a manager.
Okay. So I think, I really like that take. I think it's very different to what a lot of people put forward as a take. They think that engineering managers should stay hands-on, should have previously been software engineers, programmers, coders, should have written code, and you even see some that argue that CEOs of technical companies should still write code. That's the element I disagree with, and I think it's kind of crazy to suggest that because I've seen jobs for roles that are going to manage 400 people that require deep knowledge of UDP. I can't imagine how you can manage 400 people effectively, particularly as you start to talk about you've got P&L and responsibilities. in that area, alongside getting into configuring routers and working out how to correctly deal with some UDP multicast elements. It's the roles are too far apart for anybody to actually fit in that and do both of those to any level of competence. But I do like that element that you put there. If you don't need to necessarily be good at it, but you need to build that empathy. So you talk about Amazon having somebody in the warehouse. Do they do the same with go and spend a day with corporate finance, go and spend a day understanding the treasury function of the company, go and spend a day with sales and marketing, go out and do some customer sales work? Did it stretch to all of that as well?
So Amazon uses the term mechanism for systematic solutions to problem. To the best of my knowledge, there's nothing at the level I mentioned where that happens.
Mm-hmm.
That said, I do think starting with your first leadership role as staff or engineering manager in each of those tracks, you should do what I call the rule of two. Every week, you should talk to at least two new people at work about their work. And if you do that, you'll really quickly kind of finish all of your engineering contacts and you'll be forced to go to other fields and you'll talk to finance, you'll talk to legal, you'll talk to HR, you'll talk to recruiting. And through that, you'll build a better understanding of the business landscape. And that will translate to you being much better at your job. So that's something I recommend you start early on in your leadership career to start reaching out and learning about everyone in your company.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that. And again, as I mentioned earlier, that's something I've actually done right from day one of my career. Not intentionally. It was simply we were in the office in those days. I liked my coffee. I would be in the kitchen getting a cup of coffee, and I'd speak to anyone else that came in. You had, I don't know what it's, 2 or 3 minutes while the kettle boiled or the coffee machine made coffee. So I'd ask people what they did, ask them what the challenges were, and get to know everyone from the people working in corporate finance to the people working in the typing pool. We still had one in those days. I'm showing my age now. To the receptionist, to sales, marketing, all sorts. And I found that so useful to learn about what the business was doing, how things were really going, what are the challenges we actually faced. Very, 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 very useful. And I totally agree. I love the way you've created that more precise framework and focus on it. And with two, it's very actionable and very doable, isn't it? There's no excuse not to do that. Cool. That's awesome, Gilad. We've reached the end of our time, so any final tips you'd like to share?
The biggest tip I can give is take ownership of your career. Don't wait for anyone else. Yeah, your manager should be there to support you. Don't depend on them. Take ownership of your career and invest in yourself and continue to grow.
Yeah, love that. No one else is as invested in your career as you are. And you can have the best manager in the world, but they've got other things. They're worried about their own problems. They've got stuff that will distract them. So they'll never be as invested as you are, no matter how good they are. Cool. And finally, then, Gilad, what's the best way of anyone getting in touch with you to learn more about the management training you do, the interview training you do, and just if they want to get in contact and network and add you to their two people they meet this week?
Yeah, so I'm available on LinkedIn. Just search Gilad Naor or just managementdeltas.com.
Cool. We'll put the links in the show notes. Awesome. Thank you very much for your time, Gilad. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Likewise.